Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of January 29th, 2026. We are coming to you again this week from the Stars and Stripes Forever Division here at the Georgia Historical Society. In our ongoing commemoration of the US 250, my very special guest today is author, historian, and law professor Edward J. Larson. Ed is here to talk about why 1776 still matters. Ed Larson holds the Hugh and Hazel Darling Chair in Law and is University Professor of History at Pepperdine University in Los Angeles. Before that, he was the Russell Professor of History and held the Talmadge Chair in Law at the University of Georgia. He has been a visiting professor at Yale Law School, the University of Richmond, Stanford University, and the University of Melbourne. Originally from Mansfield, Ohio, Ed received his B.A. from Williams College, a master's from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a J.D. from Harvard Law, and a Ph.D. in the history of science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Prior to becoming a professor, Ed practiced law in Seattle and served as counsel for the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. In addition to his many books, which you'll hear about in just a moment, Ed's articles have appeared in such varied publications as Nature, The Atlantic, Science, Scientific American, Time, Wall Street Journal, American History, The Guardian, and dozens of law reviews. He is interviewed frequently for broadcast, print, cable, and internet media, including on The Daily Show, The Today Show, and multiple appearances on PBS, the BBC, the History Channel, C-SPAN, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and National Public Radio. He is the author of numerous books, a prolific author, and this is just a partial list, beginning with Summer for the Gods, The Scopes Trial and America's Continuing Debate Over Science and Religion, published by Basic Books in 1997, which won the Pulitzer Prize in History in 1998. A Magnificent Catastrophe, The Tumultuous Election of 1800, America's First Presidential Campaign, published by the Free Press in 2007. An Empire of Ice, Scott, Shackleton, and the Heroic Age of Antarctic Science, published by Yale University Press in 2011. The Return of George Washington, 1783 to 1789, published by HarperCollins in 2014. George Washington, Nationalist, published by the University of Virginia Press in 2016. To the Edges of the Earth, 1909, The Race for the Three Poles and the Climax of the Age of Exploration, published by HarperCollins in 2018. Franklin and Washington, The Founding Partnership, published by HarperCollins in 2020. American Inheritance, Liberty and Slavery in the Birth of a Nation, 1765 to 1795, published by W. Norton in 2023. And finally, the one he is here to talk about with me today, entitled Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters, published on November 11th, 2025 by W. Norton. My conversation with Ed Larson begins now. Ed Larson, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me back.
You are a prolific writer, historian. You are an attorney as well. You're a law professor, and you have written a number of books on American history, and I've read just about all of them. And your brand new one is out just in time for this US 250 commemoration, which we are now in here in 2026. This book is called Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. And before we jump into answering that question and having you talk about this momentous year in American history, I want to ask you a little bit about some of the people that you were fortunate enough to study with as you prepared your career, because you mentioned them in the introduction to this book. I'm familiar with their names as well, and so I wanted to just take a moment and talk about some of these people. You got your undergraduate degree at Williams College, and you said you studied under James McGregor Burns. What can you tell me about him, the influence he had on you, or what you remember about him?
Well, Jim Burns was he was in poli-sci, but he was a poli-sci professor, and indeed he was president of the American Political Society, Political Science Society, or whatever it's called. When I was a student of his, I took several classes with him. I got to know him quite well. And he received American Book Award and Pulitzer Prizes for his biographies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but he also wrote on Washington. He wrote on a lot of different people. He became basically the founder of leadership studies, the field of leadership studies. That really emerged after I'd left, but I worked with him on leadership studies as I became a scholar myself. Um, my favorite story to fit into this is I had expected to be a political science major, but I told him, and he was president of the American Political Science Society at the time. And I said, I don't know. I'm taking these poli sci classes, and except for yours, they're all about math and model building. And it's not that I don't can't do it. But quantitative, I really like the stuff you write, which was called qualitative. But the people who did quantitative sneer at it and call it anecdotal poli sci, and theirs is the real poli sci. And he's told me, he said, if I was going through today, I'd become a history major. And the twig is bent and the tree grows accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that he wrote a great trilogy, The Crosswinds of Freedom. That whole I've read all of that. A terrific scholar. As you mentioned, wrote the volume on George Washington and then American President series. You also mentioned that you went to grad school at the University of Wisconsin, where you studied under Norman Ristjord and Paul Boyard, which are two towering names in American history. Tell me about them.
Uh, they're great teachers, as was Jim Burns, but they were inspiring teachers. Boyer was on my PhD committee, so I not only took classes with him, but I worked very closely with him. He was. I always admired the way he brought his faith, his deep Quaker faith, to his scholarship. And in that sense, he was a little like Woodward, C. Van Woodward, in the sense that you could see, he more than I do. I try to be a pretty objective historian, objective as you can be. Of course, one's viewpoint always affects one's history, but I try to, pretty well read. But Boyer had a message, underlying message, like Woodward did in his writing. And where Wish George was just, I took courses in, he was a biographer. American Lives was his specialty. And he would take these people and just tear into them in a positive sense and really try to figure out who they were. And that's more like I try to actually do history. So I deeply appreciated the wisdom I learned from both men. They're both great. They were both great historians, and they were. Boyer was very laid back and very calm, as a Quaker should be, I guess. And Richard was frenetic, so they were very different personalities.
And I think I'm right in remembering Paul Boyer was one half of a duo that wrote a path-breaking book on the Salem witch trials. Boyer
Yeah,
and Nissenbaum, right? I think. Um,
and that shows how he would bring his deep Quaker faith um, to dealing with the subject, because of course one of the things that interests people in that, um, and that may explain where we're a little different, because many of the people who write on the Scopes trial are the same way. They bring some ideology to it, and I tried not to. What I tried to do was just figure out what really happened, not try to write a historian's version of Inherit the Wind. As much as
hmm
I enjoy Inherit the Wind, I don't
hmm
view it as good history about the Scopes trial. And Boyer, in that sense, it resonates with something like Arthur Miller's
hmm
Crucible about the
Right.
Scopes about the Salem witch trial. And
hmm
Arthur Miller was one of my professors too when I
Oh
was at
wow.
Michigan. So yeah, I got a touch of all of them.
Mm.
I was so blessed with my educational career.
And then You just, oh, and by the way, I should say before we leave the Scopes trial, I was just devastated to learn that Inherit the Wind was not great history. It was one of my favorite movies. I'm a huge Spencer Tracy fan, and when when I read your book, no,
Yeah.
say it's not so, because like most people, particularly at that age, you watch Hollywood and you think you're watching a documentary and not just entertainment. So, but we can move on from that. So then you went to Harvard to go to law school. What made you decide, especially after talking to Professor Burns, that you wanted to be a lawyer or at least go to law school?
Well, I always wanted them to work together. Actually, I hadn't finished my dissertation yet. I was working on my PhD and I was delving into questions that really tied law and the history. I was working on eugenics. I have that book on eugenics in the Deep South that delves deeply into Georgia history.
Mm-hmm.
And and it just seemed like I was running into legal issues, and that it would help me so much to understand how the law operated, to understand these issues in American history that were deeply involved with both statutes and cases. Obviously, the Scopes trial book, my Summer for the Gods, would have never existed if I hadn't also had legal training. That's how I could see it and understand it in a different way. Anyway, so I added one member to my dissertation committee from the law school, a really distinguished scholar there in constitutional law. He later became president of the University of Virginia, and not one of the controversial ones. The and uh, His name was Robert O'Neill, and he convinced me that it would really help to also get a law degree. And he had gone to Harvard, so actually I went to Harvard while finishing my dissertation. And I remained a matriculated student at Wisconsin and at Harvard at the same time, and my fellowships sort of transferred back and forth. So it was a wonderful opportunity. He suggested Harvard because for what I was doing, it had a much stronger law school than Wisconsin. Wisconsin had an incredible history program, but it was more of a nuts and bolts law school as opposed to, it did have some good legal historians, no question about that. But for the exact type of what I was trying to do, Harvard was a better place. And so I ended up getting two experiences. And then at Harvard, I got to know many of the law faculty there and worked close and the history faculty there, and worked with some of them. So it further fleshed out and rounded out my history background. There are a few distinguished, as good as Wisconsin was, there were a few distinguished historians at Harvard as well.
Well, one of the that you mentioned was Bernard Balin, of course,
Yeah.
and that you got to work with him. So I just all these names, I thought, boy, this is the people that you do not go into the vineyard of graduate school in history without becoming familiar with these people and very familiar, and you knew them as people. And Balin was a prolific historian as well,
And
immensely.
with a real specialty in the Revolutionary War, because the
Hmm.
other people you named, Rich George certainly did the Revolutionary War, but
Yes.
the other people weren't as much the
Mm.
Revolutionary War. But Bernard Balin with Edmund Morgan, you're talking about, those are the two absolute, at my time, my age, when
Yes.
I was in grad school, they were the two superstars in the Revolutionary era. Others later
Yeah.
came up, but those were the two.
Those are the two that are on Mount Rushmore still. Absolutely. And you also mentioned in the law school Morton Horowitz and Lawrence Tribe, who are of course sort of legendary on their own as well. Um, how do you choose what you want to write about? Because you have written about a lot of different things in your career. I know you started with the history of science. You got a poster behind you of your book on George Washington, which I read and enjoyed very much, and it covers the years after the Revolution, from '83 to '89, which is a really fascinating and sort of understudied period of Washington. But how does Ed Larson decide what he wants to write about?
Well, that book, what you just said, is the sort of key to it. I'm curious about lots of things. I don't like to be bored. I like to do new things. I don't want to redo what other people have done. And so I've been teaching for the Washington book, and it'd be a good example, as I said. I'd been teaching, you know, American history at University of Georgia, including the opening survey, to the sea of thousands out there.
Yes.
And you get, I knew the literature on Washington really well. And you get a lot of Washington in the Revolution, of course. And you get a lot of Washington as president, but you don't get anything in between. And I reviewed the books about Washington, including Pulitzer Prize winning book after Pulitzer Prize winning book. The big series on Washington, the Fleschner's shorter series, true of Chernow's book, which won a Pulitzer Prize. They skip. They deal with Washington, the young Washington. There's lots of books about that. The guy, what shaped him, and Washington in the Revolutionary War, of course, their Legion. And then there's like a gap. And if they still anything, and even when we're talking about 5-volume sets, and if they do anything during that gap after he steps down as general, in his famous resignation in Annapolis, and before he comes back, either the Constitutional Convention or more fully when he's inaugurated in 89, they talk about, well, he went back to the plantation, and then they talk about him as a farmer, if they say anything. And yeah, he was an interesting farmer who was very, very interested in farming and plantation work, and he transformed a played out tobacco plantation that he inherited into a very profitable wheat plantation because he understood that. And he developed the largest whiskey distillery in the United States to consume all the wheat he was producing. He brought in new grinding wheels. Sure, it was interesting because you can talk about it, but they don't talk anything about his ongoing politics. And it always puzzled me because I figured here was a man who had served for years, really, from 1775 to 1783, without pay, as he got his expenses, but without formal pay, as commander-in-chief. Absolutely devoted his life to that. Devoted his life to getting the independence for the United States. Hands-on, working with the governors, working with Hancock and Congress, and really he staked everything on this new republic. And then he's just going to leave and ignore it, even though the thing we do cover, the whole experiment is collapsing, not in every state, but in many states, including especially in Georgia, collapsing during that in-between time under the Articles of Confederation. They just weren't working. And I say, he just does nothing. And then he comes out because he's pulled out and goes back to the Constitutional Convention. It doesn't make any sense. And so what I wanted to do was, because nobody, and then when I looked at all the books, they too left it as a gap. So I wanted to fill in the gap. I'm always interested in filling in the gaps. I don't want to do what somebody has done before. I want to do something new. And so what I did was I just decided I'm going to read everything. I'm going to read all his letters, which are generally available. I'm going to, I went up and spent time living at Mount Vernon in their house. So that was their first fellow that they had there. They hadn't even opened the library yet when I moved there, but they were going to open it. And I wanted to see what he was doing. And I found out that wasn't a story at all. He was farming. Sure, he got his farm back to profitability. And it was a marginal farms plantation. So he was a good hands-on manager. So when he was there, it made money. When he wasn't there, it really didn't make money. And he was involved, but he was totally involved from before he resigned, as with his writing his circular letter to the states just before he stepped down as commander-in-chief, throughout, writing letters, being involved, communicating with others, helping to finding out about how beforehand, how the Constitution, what should be in the Constitution. He was totally involved in uniting the states into a stronger central union. If anything, he hosted the Mount Vernon Conference, which was the sort of the stepping stone where Virginia and Maryland worked out their differences. Because under the Articles of Confederation, each of the states were totally sovereign. They had tariffs against the other states. They didn't, they were just sovereign. They were in the Articles of Confederation by its own terms was merely a league of friendship, sort of like the UN. And it never had a quorum because it didn't do anything. And so he becomes totally involved. He hosts the Mount Vernon Compact that worked out the trade differences and relationship between Maryland and Virginia, which led to the Annapolis Conference, which in turn led to the Constitutional Convention. So what I was able to flesh out going through all those materials was Washington's role in, well, as I call the subtitle of the book, uniting the states. And he did it during that in-between time. And so that would be an example. Your question was, of course, how do I pick a topic? Well, I look for a gap which other people haven't done. I don't want to redo what has already been well done. I want to instead go in and try to find something new, which I tried to do with the Election of 1800 book. But of course, that was what made the Scopes book work, because no historian, everybody knew about the Scopes trial. There were movies about it. There were books written by, well, one was written by a science fiction writer, another was written by a journalist, but no historian had brought the skills of a historian to that topic. So basically it was virgin territory. And, I can't necessarily, since I don't think I'm necessarily better than some of other historians, I have a leg up when I'm tackling something that people know about, but people haven't studied as a historian.
Which brings us to your new book, Declaring Independence, which really focuses intently on the year 1776. Now, and right from the jump, you sort of tackle the question because there's a historian recently passed, David McCulloch, who wrote a book. His follow-up to John Adams was 1776, and right away you sort of tackle how you're gonna. Your book is, first of all, it's not long, 170 pages of text. We'll talk about that. But how did you how did you plow ground differently than other people? Maybe most prominently, somebody like McCulloch.
Well, McCulloch's book is entirely military history.
Mm-hmm.
He follows the battles of 1776, which is great. And so I didn't try, except to the fact that they played into the larger story, I didn't try to follow the battles. Actually, today, if you want to read the battles of 1776, McCulloch's been eclipsed by Rick Atkinson, who I think is a fabulous military historian, probably maybe the best military historian today. And his book, The British Are Coming, covers the years 1775 and 6, and really does a lot more primary research. I don't know if he can write as well as McCulloch. McCulloch was a great storyteller, but his is entirely military history. And so he doesn't cover Tom Paine's Common Sense. He doesn't cover the Declaration of Independence. It's in really a paragraph. He doesn't mention the state constitutions of 1776, including, of course, Georgia's, which actually was finally January of 1777, but it was really written in 76. And all the states came up with new constitutions that year. And so what I was trying to do, remember, I'm an intellectual historian. I studied under people like Boyer, as you mentioned. And so I wanted to figure out not what happened on the battlefield in that year, but what changed? Why did, when you hear about, I mean, we all talk, spirit of 1776. You hear that all the time. You run into it in the oddest places, but people never talk about the spirit of 1775. There was another good book about why 1775 mattered. Was that Mary Beth Norton? There was another one about 1774. I always forget who wrote it.
Yeah, Norton wrote the one on 74. Yeah.
What?
Yeah,
And then
Norton
there
wrote
was
the one in
another one in
74.
1775, and they
Yeah.
were trying to argue that they were important. And I agree,
Hmm.
they were
Hmm.
both important. I'm
Hmm.
not trying to say that 1776 was necessarily more important than 1775. 1775 had the Battle of Bunker Hill, the appointment of Washington's commander in chief. It has the Declaration of Causes for taking up arms. It has Lexington and Concord. I mean, how do you top those? You don't top them in the battles of 1776. So on the battlefield, 1775 was probably more important. But it changed. If you look, so what I did, I said, okay, what do people, when they say spirit of 1776, take, for example, this great new TV show put together about the revolution that was on PBS. That's also great. But what that tells you is about the revolution. And we don't hear about the spirit of the revolution. If you call the Revolutionary War, that covers a lot of years. So why do people say spirit of 1776? What is that spirit? And it's not just now. We use the phrase, but they used it at the time. Jefferson, Adams, they used it at the time. If you look at the Great Seal of the United States, which for convenience is on the back of your $1 bill, and it says Nova, it says a new order in the world. And then it gives the date. That's in Latin, but that's what it means. Or something new under the sun is a very loose translation of it.
Hmm.
But then it gives a date. And it says 1776 on it. It's Roman numerals, but 17. Lincoln looks back 7 years ago. That's 1776. That's not 1783, which is technically when the war ended and Britain recognized our independence, which internationally is a key date. It's not 1771 when the Battle of Yorktown effectively won the war. It's not 1787 when they wrote the Declaration, drafted the Constitution, or 1789. It's 1776. In fact, when I was just a few weeks ago, I was at the Texas Book Festival with this book, and I was cutting through. If you ever go to Texas, they got this big Capitol, but unlike Georgia, they got this huge grounds, and it's filled with monuments. There are monuments everywhere, monuments over everything. It's like walking around Gettysburg. There are monuments everywhere on this and that. And the biggest one is to the Confederate war dead. And it's right in the middle. And so I went by it. So I looked at it, and it says on it, these men came out to fight in the spirit of 1776. Gosh. And that's, they're fighting for this, the Confederate side in the Civil War. So everybody uses this. Why 1776? So what I did is I decided, because they're available now, I decided to read all the newspapers that I could get my hands on. A lot of them are electronic, but some weren't, from the period. And we had a lot of newspapers, but read all the letters of Washington, all the letters of Adams and Jefferson and soldiers. There are a lot of collections of soldiers in the field, especially Massachusetts soldiers. Read all those. Abigail Adams, read different people. Mercy Warren, read their letters and see what happened in that year. McCollum didn't try to do that. He followed the battles that went through. And what I found was an amazing transition of thought, that in the beginning of 1776, virtually no one was, at least publicly, but even privately, supportive of independence. What they were fighting for, and they've been fighting for it since 1765, which was when the Stamp Act crisis began. So they've been fighting it for 10 years. They had been arguing and actually fighting Battle of Lexington, Battle of Concord, the siege of Boston, fighting for their rights as English subjects of the king. And they consistently said that. They said that in the Declaration of Causes for taking up arms in July 6th of 1775, when they when Congress explained why it had appointed Washington and taken on its commander-in-chief and taken on the 15,000 person New England militia, then sieging Boston, besieging the troops in Boston. They said it in the Olive Branch petition. They said it in everything. All they were fighting for were what they believed were their equal rights as British subjects of the king. That all changes really in January. And thereafter, by the end of the year, the overwhelming majority of patriots were fighting for independence, for fighting for creating independent states. All the states, virtually all the states, had adopted new state constitutions, thrown out their charters, royal charters that were issued by the king, and written new state constitutions claiming the people are sovereign. The king is no longer sovereign. It's declared, of course, in the Declaration of Independence, but it's in resolutions. The resolution on independent governments passed by the Congress in May, which John Adams always thought was the equivalent was the real Declaration of Independence. And of course, he wrote the preamble. His own thoughts on government speech. So that's what changed. Americans changed from seeking their rights as British subjects to seeking their liberty as American citizens. And that's the story I try to tell. And that's not even, that's simply not the story McCollum's trying to tell. He's trying to tell what happened on the battlefield, and he does it well.
And in mentioning McCulloch, I do not want to give the impression that what you're doing here is arguing with other historians, because I have to note one of the things I was most struck by in your book, because I love to dig into the notes. I want to see, when you tell us about Thomas Paine, or you talk about the Halifax Resolves, I always look to see, well, what other literature is out there about this? What have you looked at? And I was really astonished to see that you rely, and you mention this, and it comes through, almost exclusively on primary sources. Your interest here is not really to take issue with what other historians have written. You're not dismissive of it. I don't mean to suggest that you don't think it's important, but what you're trying to do here, this is Ed Larson reading deeply in the primary sources and then interpreting those for us, the reader. If you want to know where an extended bibliography on the history of 1776, your notes are not the place to look for it. That does not mean that you don't know about the books. I know that you do. But that was a decision that you made, to really stick to the primary sources, to read those, and to cite only those. Because otherwise, this book probably would have been 3 times longer than it is, at least in the notes, I suspect. But that was a decision you made, right?
Right. I wanted to. I think that's true in all my books, but I love archival work. As much as I love writing history, I love researching history. And I want to get it right, because I find that when I use secondary sources, I'm reading sort of their interpretation. And rarely, often some historians don't even give the source of quotes. Often historians actually when they use what looks like an original quote from a newspaper or a letter, when you look, you find out they didn't even read the letter. They pulled the quote from another secondary history book.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quoted by somebody else, and then they quote it again. And when I go back and read everything in context, and often I freely admit that while I read through all the stuff myself, I do read all the secondary sources, every secondary source I can find on a topic, and I have them open and I refer to them when I'm writing to check, see what they're saying. I'm not bound by their interpretation, but a lot of times I'll see a quote and says, "Oh, I didn't find that. Huh? He said John Adams said that," and I look back and find out the site. If some of them don't even give footnotes, but if they do, and often it'll be to it from another book. Sometimes it'll be the original source. So then I have to go and get the other book that it's from and look where they quote it's from. So I try to trace down. I said, I didn't find Adam saying that. And then I look back and find, when I read the original source of that, when I read Adams' letter, for example, John Adams' letter or George Washington's letter, I find, that quote's not quite right. That's been, like when you were in grade school and used to play that game where you'd tell somebody, whisper something, and they'd whisper, and they'd
Telephone,
whisper, and they'd whisper.
right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it changes. I'm not saying it's malicious. I'm not saying they're trying to redo the quote to serve their purposes, but it's a little bit different. And we're different. A lot of times back in the old day, before people would have, even me when I got started, I'm the old day. Um, you'd be going through the letters and you'd have to write it out yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
you'd make a little mistake. You'd drop a the, you'd change a the to an a, or there'd be a little thing like this, or you wouldn't capitalize right, you wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
underline right. When you go back to the original, you get to find out exactly what they said. And also you get to read it in context. And when you read it beyond that little excerpt of 12 words, when you read the whole thing, I don't think that's what he was saying. I think he was saying something different. Look at the context. And so that's what I try to do as a historian. Always go back. That was beat into me by my professors, that you always go back to the original. And and then I try to give a citation to the original so that people can look it up in the original and check me for how I've used it.
And I noted that throughout. You would quote something from the first draft of of the Declaration, for instance, and you're not quoting from the middle of a Jefferson biography. You're quoting from the page in the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, in which this is hashed over. Famously, I want to read John Adams' quote. This goes to the heart of what you wrote the book about, but also what we're talking about right now. The famous letter from Jefferson to Adams, from Adams to Jefferson, excuse me, when he says, "What do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people," unquote, which goes to the heart of what you're trying to get at in this book. What happened in 1776 that turned a war for a restoration of British rights to citizens who lived in America to a revolution. And if you look up the footnote for that quote, what you get is exactly where Adams wrote to Jefferson. And he said that. It's not quoted from David McCulloch's biography. And I noticed that all through the book, that your use of secondary sources is very sparing. Occasionally, you will note, for instance, that Eric Foner, for instance, wrote a nice book about Thomas Paine in 1970s, but you don't rely upon that for your interpretation of Thomas Paine. You sunk yourself deeply into these sources.
Yeah, I try to guide people if if there's an important secondary source. I use the footnotes rather than citing them. I use the footnotes to direct people to them,
Mm-hmm.
just like Paulette Meyer wrote, a critical account of the Declaration of Independence.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want people to be able to go to that, but I don't quote her interpretation. I try to give my own. And if you went on, by the way, on that quote you read, if you in addition, either before that or after that, he points to this, and it was all over by the revolution.
Yeah.
The revolution in their minds was all over by 1776.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm interested in is when I'm trying to think about why did 1776 matters, what I concludes is that revolution that Adams is talking about, that Americans had changed their mind. They had given up on the king. They had given up on monarchy. They had always looked at him or the king or the monarch as sovereign, and they sought their liberty as British subjects. They gave up on that, and they adopted something that was something new under the sun. There were no there was well the state constitution of 1776 are the first written constitutions ever written in world history. And the idea that we would be a government under law, a government of law, a government where, as Adams repeatedly said, where the law is king, the rule of law is dominant. That was something new because, in Britain, the king was the law and the king was sovereign. And most of the world had ruling monarchs. I mean, you had a few odd sort of republics, Switzerland then, the Venetian Republic then, Dubrovnik then. You had a few, but they weren't the sort of thing at all. They were sort of common law republics. They had no constitutions. The law wasn't king. they were sort of like New England town meetings in the case of Switzerland. Um, and so there was a sense of popular sovereignty there, but nothing like what Paine or Adams or Jefferson or Franklin had in mind for America, and that people like Washington totally signed in for. And that's the story I try to tell. And when you read Adams, like Adams's Thoughts on Government, which comes out in May of 1776, and probably is the most important pamphlet, most important thing John Adams ever wrote. Incredibly influential for shaping the state constitutions and then indirectly the federal constitution. But and he writes that when in all of history, since the day of Noah, have people had the opportunity to create their own governments? It's never happened, is what he's saying. This is a phenomenal new thing. This is not, as our Paine would say, this is not the cause of a day or a week. This is not a cause of a state or a city. This is global. This is the sun never shone, he wrote, on such a cause. Now think of the audacity in January of 1776 to say what was brewing out here on the frontier, in the so-called New World, far from Europe, was something that the sun never shone on, something as important, that this is going to change the world, that all of posterity is resting on this. That's what Paine had the audacity to say in January, and Adams says much the same thing in May, and Franklin and Washington, and you can get it in Jefferson, you can get it in all these people. They thought they were something. Think of it. Countries splinter off of other countries all the time. Nations splinter off. You go back to the Greeks, the Romans, you go back to prehistory. Nations are always splitting off of other nations. Regions become independent and then go back together. You can never stop describing them all. And yet, here these people were saying this. So in a sense, that's all that the colonies were doing. They were splintering off of the British Empire. But now they're saying this is not that. This is not what we're about. We're about something fundamentally different. And they felt that. And that is at heart the spirit of 1776. And it's really, Adams is right. The battles are important. And they made a difference. I'm not trying to dismiss them. As I say, Atkinson or McCollum, important books. But what I'm interested in is this thing that made this different, made this year so fundamental, such a pivot in world history. And that's the story I'm trying to tell. Now, the words, the ideas in Paine and Adams and Jefferson and Declaration of Independence, the ideas inspired deeds, and the deeds on the battlefield inspired ideas and words. So there was sort of a dynamic back and forth, and I try to cover that. So I do cover the battles, but if you really want to get the battles, I do cover them for that year. I think fairly completely, but I direct you to Rick Atkinson.
Mm-hmm. What you're describing here is really the heart of in some ways, the whole business of why we would commemorate something 250 years later. And I want to just take a moment to set this up. What you were just describing when you said countries have split off, we're talking about what we would now call separatist movements. They have been going on throughout history. They are still going on. There are conflicts around the world right now where one group of people is trying to split off from another. Sometimes it's peaceful. Usually it is not. It happens the same way that our, quote, revolution did. The military victories had to secure the idea of being separate. But this wasn't just a separatist movement. And I want to make this point. 250 years later, the country from which we separated, it's still a constitutional monarchy. It's still not a republic. It's a constitutional monarchy. It has parliamentary democracy. It calls itself a democracy, but it's still not a republic.
And it doesn't have a written constitution to this day.
It doesn't have a written constitution. And the point I'm really getting at, and I don't want to get political here, but we do have to recognize the moment in which we are living right now. Many people then and ever since have said republics always end up in one place, and that is a strong man, right? Napoleon was waiting at the end of the French Revolution. That our republic right now, there are people who fear that we're headed in the same direction, that the strong man is always at the end of that. In other words, right now, if you ask the people in this country to choose their government, we aren't sure, some people would say, that they would choose republics. They might choose something else, some version of monarchy or some version of authoritarianism. These 13 colonies all chose to a person to become republics, not to become some watered down version of Great Britain. Any of them could have, presumably, chosen, you know what, Vermont can be a republic if it wants to, but down here in Georgia, we kind of like the idea of having a strong executive. So that's what we're going to do. None of them did that. They all chose to be republics. Can you, that's a very long setup, explain what was in the water? What was in the air? Was it in their tradition of self government over 150 years since the early 17th century that led these people to choose this particular form of government, which they had always been warned would always land? People cannot govern themselves, it will always go to a bad place.
Well, to emphasize your point, Adams wrote during that point that uh, democracies always commit suicide. That was his. He wrote that in a letter to the Virginia, Massachusetts Guard. Um, Franklin, after the Constitutional Convention, when he was when he of course, the doors had been closed during the Constitutional Convention. And when he saw Elizabeth Powell, he came out. Elizabeth Powell was sort of a leading dame of Philadelphia, and she had a lot of soirees at her house um, and during the convention. And she says, well, what have you created? And he said, well, it's a republic if you can keep it. Another famous line. That was Franklin. You can find everyone saying, you can find Jefferson, similar observations by Jefferson, by Madison, by every one of them. So yeah, that's a concern. Can you keep a republic? But Washington would be an example of this. Washington was deeply committed. Washington had several times, he was offered total command. He had a chance at Newburgh during that period after the Battle of Yorktown, but before the British had formally acknowledged American independence. And there was a revolt of the soldiers in Newburgh, and they wanted to make him basically the military leader, sort of like happened later with Napoleon, or would arguably happen with Cromwell. Happened with arguably was going to happen with Caesar. That's why the Senate killed him. So yes, there's that concern, but Washington turned that down because what these people believed, and you can see it so many times. You'll see it all throughout the book. You'll see Washington write this, but you'll see Adams and Paine, Jefferson said that the problem, they became convinced. They started the objections to the started the run up to the revolution with the crisis over taxes, the stamp taxes and the sugar taxes in 1765. And so they objected that Parliament shouldn't be imposing taxes on unrepresented citizens, that they should adopt their own taxes subject to approval by the king. And Parliament shouldn't do it without them. But then the Parliament did the Declaratory Act saying, we, and no Americans voted for members of Parliament, we can rule you in all things whatsoever. That was a Declaratory Act of 1766. And so they were first fighting for their rights, which they thought they had as British citizens, that certain things, such as taxation, is governed by the Parliament or the elected legislature. And they thought it should have to go through their assemblies, like the House of Burgesses in Virginia. And that was their goal. Or Franklin tried to argue that there be representation in Parliament from the United States, from the colonies. But they began to realize that that's not the problem. The problem is authoritarian rule. And if we want to protect our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and we always think, oh, how clever of Jefferson to think of pursuit of happiness. No, it wasn't clever of him at all. And he admitted that. He was borrowing. Adams had used the phrase, the goal of government is to maximize happiness of the people. Paine in Common Sense says the goal of government should be the maximum happiness for the people at the minimum cost. He was more of a libertarian in his viewpoints, but they all talked about happiness. So Jefferson was just borrowing on what was in the air. So the goal of government was human happiness. Now, Americans had come to that, I believe, because they were living in a frontier and they were, by their own merit, were carving out their own opportunities and carving out their own happiness on the frontier. That's why they came to the New World. That's why they opened the Georgia frontier. They were seeking their own well-being, their own happiness. And they became convinced that that was the goal of government. You can see it in John Locke. They were borrowing from Locke. They were borrowing from Rousseau, that you form governments, you give up certain liberties to have protection and then maximize happiness. And they became convinced that the only way you're going to maximize happiness is to have a republic. Either decide for yourself like a town meeting, or have a republic where you had free, fair, and frequent elections with them always coming back to the people, so that the people are sovereign. That was in the great North Carolina Constitution. Their opening line is, we hereby declare that the people and only the people are sovereign. That's the opening line of the new North Carolina Constitution of 1776. And they believed that that was the key to security, liberty, and happiness for the people. That is, to have the people rule through their elected representatives who were freely, fairly, and frequently elected. They typically had one-year terms, and they were constantly brought back in so the people would rule. That was their deep belief. It came from Locke. It came from their own experience. It came from the New England experience. It came from their religion, where religions, like the Puritan religion and the Congregational religion and the Methodist religion, the various, which are very bottom up as opposed to top down, like the Catholic or the Episcopal Church. So it came from a lot of their experiences. And now their fear is they're going to lose it. Famously, and you see this throughout, they talk about virtue, but what they mean is it's captured greatly when Patrick Henry at the Virginia ratifying convention for the U.S. Constitution, he opposes ratification. He says this is going to end up in a dictatorship, which is exactly what Franklin had warned about it. And Madison looks him back, and it's all recorded, and says, you're not, because he says people end up being dictators, power corrupts. And he says, and Madison says, you're wrong. You're not, you're looking at the leaders. I'm looking at the people. And as long as the people have virtue, and as long as the people control the elections, they'll throw out somebody like that. But the key to this is, you're right, it's tricky, but you're not having proper faith in the people. And you can read this in Franklin, you can read it in Jefferson, you can read it in Adams. Adams once says, this government was only written for a virtuous people. It assumes a virtuous people. And as long as people are educated and virtuous and express their own views, this will last. When that doesn't happen, you'll lose it. And so Benjamin Franklin had given that final talk at the Philadelphia Convention. It was all written down and published, the only part of the convention that was published at the time, where he says, I fear that this government, as any other, will end in despotism. But it'll only do so when the people lose the virtue to keep it, because we've given ultimate power to the people. And so that's when he comes out and says to Elizabeth Powell, it's a republic if you That is, you, the people, can keep it. So that's the key. The key isn't the leaders, Madison and Franklin and Washington and Jefferson would say. The key is the citizens.
And that, excuse me, was reflected in so many of these constitutions because, as originally written, and you talk about this in your book, they weakened the executive, if it existed at all, down to the point of being almost non existent in most states. Governors were very weak. They worked with legislative, which the lower house of most legislatures were the most powerful. They were the closest to the people. They were the ones that held elections regularly. They were the
Mm-hmm.
ones for whom tax bills, originated
Yeah.
because the people need to tax themselves. They're the ones that do this. That changed, of course.
Following up on that, if I can,
Yeah,
you
please.
know, is for that, look at Franklin's Constitution.
Hmm.
Franklin, in the middle of this whole thing, Franklin, he's co-written the Declaration of Independence with Jefferson. He added the um, self-evident phrase and different things. He'd been involved with the battles that had gone up to Canada. He was just getting ready to leave for France to be the ambassador, and he takes time to chair the Constitutional Convention, writing the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. And he's incredibly involved in drafting it. But look at the Constitution he drafts. He is dealing with just the issues you're saying. Um, in his Constitution, um, because he's relying on the people, there is an annual all powers in the. There's a very weak governor. There's a very weak council or upper house. All powers really in the assembly, the lower assembly. The assembly is elected every year, annually, in these, and it has to be fair redistricting. So his goal is to get everyone represented in some way or another. That is, all groups represented, because you don't want a gerrymander. They didn't know the term then, but you want fair representation. And then what has to happen is all bills have to be published in the newspapers. They didn't have the internet then, so newspapers had to publish all bills so that the public can see them, and the public had time to debate them. Then the legislature would consider and vote on that bill, just the lower house. The lower house would vote on it. Bills could only be one subject. There are no big, beautiful bills, one subject, so the people could understand them. The subject of that bill had to be described in the title, so people could, in their busy days, could still basically know what was in every bill. Then the legislature, after there was time for the public to get back to them, the legislature passed it. But, and this was his clever idea, Franklin was a system builder, came up with the Franklin stove, figured out the Gulf Stream, figured out electricity. Then the bill doesn't become law yet. What it does is, then when the session ends, the legislature goes home, and the people have time with this legislation. Then the legislators have to run again. They've had time to discuss this legislation. Then the new legislators have to approve the bill. So the check and balance is not a House and a Senate, but is a check and balance from one legislature to another, with the voters having time in between to consider that legislation and say, no, I'm not going to vote that guy back in because I didn't like I don't like this bill, or tell him you can't vote for that bill or we won't have you. So he's putting the people right at this. It's sort of like the initiative and referendum process that came out later, or other sort of populist changes in government from the around 1900, 100 years ago, 1890s. And but Franklin's trying to work that into the Constitution. That's part of the spirit of 1776. And I don't know, honestly, I don't know any other historian who's ever discussed that, but I do in my book.
And it's fascinating, and it goes right to the heart of. I mean, you're ultimately, I think, your aim in writing this book is we enter this U.S. 250 commemoration is you want the American people to have a greater understanding of what happened in that year, what made our revolution. And I'm going to ask this question. I think I know that your answer, but I want to give you the opportunity to answer. One of the things that we are really focusing on here at the Georgia Historical Society is the notion that the American Revolution was not an event, but an idea. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Yep. I do. And you said you know my answer. So what else would you say to it? And I'll
And
this
it's an
helps
ongoing.
me to hear it from you because
It
you know this stuff. You know this stuff as well as I do.
Well, I think, I mean, one of the things I learned in your book, and in terms of it's an idea that the people, and it was really what the heart of what I was asking about and why they chose republics, the idea that the people are sovereign, the people govern. And that all of this flows from the people choose their own leaders, and those leaders come from the people and they go back to the people. They don't become royal, they don't become kings, they don't become autocrats. And so the idea ultimately that comes out of 1776, why it matters is, I think, in part because it is still ongoing. This is a trust
Yeah.
that has been handed down to us that we still struggle with. We all know that this has changed a great deal. The executive has become extraordinarily powerful, not least of which we could go on this podcast for another hour and talk about Washington's influence in that constitutional convention on the executive branch. His stepping away from power after the revolution was over. They all knew he would be the first president. They knew he could be trusted with power. What happened after that? I don't know what they thought would happen after that. I guess they thought everybody would follow his example. And for the most part, I think they have. I would ask you what you hope for our country as we enter this momentous year and this momentous time in our existence. What do you hope will come out of the commemorations of the US 250 for us as a people, for us as a country?
Well, as you suggested, and I appreciate your comments so much. Um, I'm totally on board. I think you certainly read the book, what I get out of the same period. But as you know, I'm a Washington fan. And I'm not saying the person didn't have flaws. He did. But he was amazing. When I think of the greatest presidents, he's right up there in the top three.
Mm-hmm.
He belongs where he is on Mount Rushmore. And the reason is he, in so many ways, personified. He wasn't a great speaker. He was a good writer, but he wasn't a great speaker, partly because he didn't have, his false teeth were awful. So he could
Right.
barely, when he opened his mouth, the teeth would fall together. Um, so he couldn't really speak well. But he he lived this. He resigned twice. He resigned as president after 2 terms, which wasn't required back then, and he also stepped down as the leader of the troops. And he turned down various opportunities to become basically a strongman.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Franklin said, I have a lot at the last speech at the Constitutional Convention. I have a lot of misgivings about this. He objected to the power given to the executive. He thought too much. There was a whole bunch of that he accepted. He says, but I'm willing to go with this and try it because I trust, and this is what he said, I trust the first man who will hold that office. Trust that he will do well. And that's going later. He said it's a republic if you keep it. And he went on to say that all governments end in tyranny, and I don't expect any different from this. But he trusted Washington, and that's been challenged throughout. That was Hamilton's objection to Aaron Burr becoming president. Hamilton, even though he was a Federalist and said there's no man in his letters to the members of Congress when they were deciding whether Burr or Jefferson would be president, that I talk about in Magnificent Catastrophe, he said, there's no man I should hate more than Jefferson. But you can't put Burr in, even though policy-wise I agree more with Burr. The guy, he said, he's a tyrant. He cares only about himself. And Jefferson, even though I disagree with his ideas, he's an honorable man. And he'll be an honorable president. I just, don't agree with some of his
Which is
ideas.
an extraordinary moment, really.
And so Hamilton buys in. And when the Federalists are all lined up behind Burr and could have pushed it through. And so Jefferson ends up becoming president in 1801. And turns out to be an extraordinarily good president. He got us, the Louisiana Purchase and paid off our debt all at once. So it's a it's a constant battle, and it's a constant concern. And as several of these leaders will say, and I quote some of them in the book, but there's a lot more. They say, the people will get the government they deserve. And what our constitutions give us is the opportunity to get a government of the people. Washington said in his first inaugural address, Lincoln will pick it up and extend it later, but he said, this is a government of the people and by the people. Lincoln later adds for the people, but that's from Washington. Actually that part of the Constitution was drafted by some other people for him, but that was his phraseology. And that's what we have. And I think it's a magnificent idea, and it's a magnificent dream. And so I hope that remembering 1776 in the 200th and 50th incarnation will help remind people about this noble experience, something new under the sun, an opportunity such as Adam said, such as hasn't happened since the days of Noah, to begin something new. And now we can see and it has swept the world. It is an ideal. Not every country lives up to it. We don't either. But it's good to go back and think about what these people cared about it. They went through a lot. They fought a war for it. They had also, before the war, they had fought these battles. They had faced down on a George III who was corrupt with power, and a parliament that was trying to lord it over them. And we're now living in the American experiment. It's a day-to-day affair.
It sure is. Well, and we're lucky to have a historian of your caliber and your talents to write about it, and to write about it in a way that I think Thomas Paine would have appreciated, in a way that people who are not historians can read and learn and understand what was happening. You do not need to be a specialist to read this new book by Ed Larson. It's called Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. It's published by W.W. Norton, and I should add that Ed is going to be in Savannah for the book festival on Saturday, February 7th. If you are listening to this before that date, come out and you will hear him talk in person about some of the things that we've been discussing. Ed, thank you for coming on here and talking about this book, and continued good luck with all the things you're doing.
Thank you for having me. I get back to Georgia all the time, all my years in Athens. And once again, I've got Georgia on my mind. Thank you.
My thanks to Ed Larson for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at www.norton.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Krellin. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. If you're a fan of Today in Georgia History, and who isn't, check it out at the completely redesigned website at todayingeorgiahistory.org, and you can see it and hear it currently airing twice a day on TV and radio on Georgia Public Broadcasting. You can find this podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app, which would be most helpful and appreciated. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow, subscribe, and share with a friend, and drop me a line at sdeaton@georgiahistory.com. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. You can also treat yourself to every podcast, every blog, and every video entitled Dispatches from Off the Beaten Path at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.